there is a photograph that has outlived every statistic, every trophy, every record that was ever written down. It was taken on the 10th of May, 1970, inside the old Boston Garden, and it shows a young man in a white jersey with the number 4 on his back, flying through the air. His arms are raised, his stick is lifted toward the ceiling, his body is horizontal, parallel to the ice, as if gravity itself had decided, just for a moment, to let him go. He had just scored the goal that won the Stanley Cup, and in that single frozen instant, the entire sport of hockey changed forever. The man in that photograph was Robert Gordon Orr. He was 22 years old, and the game he played that night, and every night before and after it, was unlike anything the hockey world had ever seen or would ever see again. Before that moment, before the fame, before the injuries that would steal nearly everything from him, Bobby Orr was simply a boy from Parry Sound, Ontario, a small town on the eastern shore of Georgian Bay, tucked away from the bright lights and the noise of the bigger cities. A place where winters came early and stayed long, where frozen ponds and outdoor rinks were the first classroom for anyone who wanted to learn the game. And in that town, on a sheet of natural ice that cracked and groaned under the weight of the cold, a child no older than 4 or 5 began to skate. Not just skate. He moved with a speed and a certainty that made grown adults stop whatever they were doing and stare. His father, a man who had played the game himself and understood what talent looked like, watched his son glide across that ice and knew, in the quiet way that parents sometimes know, that this child was different. By the time Bobby was 12 years old, the entire hockey establishment in Canada knew his name. Scouts travelled from distant cities just to watch him play. They stood in freezing arenas, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, and they watched a boy do things with a hockey puck that most professional players could not do. But knowing his name and understanding what he would become are 2 very different things. Because Bobby Orr did not simply play defense, he reimagined it. He took a position that had been defined for more than half a century, by caution, by discipline, by staying back, by clearing the puck and guarding the net, and he transformed it into something no one had ever dreamed was possible. He became the first defenseman in the history of the National Hockey League to lead the league in scoring. Not once, twice. He won the Norris Trophy as the best defenseman in the league 8 consecutive times. 8. He won the Hart Trophy as the league's most valuable player 3 times. He won the Art Ross Trophy as the league's leading scorer twice. He did all of this while playing a position that was supposed to be about stopping goals, not scoring them. And he did it on knees that were failing him from the time he was a teenager. That is the contradiction at the heart of this story. The most gifted hockey player many have ever seen, a man who could do things with a puck that seemed to defy the laws of physics, was also the most fragile. His body was not built to sustain the punishment that the game demanded. The cartilage in his knees, the tissue that cushions the bones and allows the joint to move smoothly, began deteriorating early in his career. And yet, he played through it. He played through surgeries that would have ended lesser careers. He played through swelling and pain that left him unable to walk after games. He played through injections and draining procedures and the constant, grinding reality of bone rubbing against bone. He gave everything he had to the game, every ounce of talent, every drop of courage, every moment of brilliance his body would allow. And in return, the game took everything from him. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand not just the brilliance of Bobby Orr, but the price he paid for it. You are going to understand why the image of that young man flying through the air in Boston Garden is both a celebration and a farewell, a single, frozen moment that captured everything beautiful about hockey and everything heartbreaking about what it costs to play at the highest level the sport has ever known. You will understand the boy from the small town, the teenager who left home at 14, the young man who saved a franchise, the legend who redefined a position, and the human being who endured more pain and more betrayal than any athlete should ever have to endure. This is a story about genius, about sacrifice, about a small-town boy who walked into one of the oldest arenas in professional sports and changed the way an entire game was played. It is also a story about loss, about what happens when the thing you love most in this world, the thing that makes you feel most alive, is slowly taken from you, one surgery at a time, until all that remains is the memory of what you once were. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let's begin. To understand what Bobby Orr did, you must first understand what existed before him. You must understand the position he played, the role it was designed to serve, and how deeply entrenched that role was in the culture of hockey for more than half a century before he ever laced up a pair of skates. Because Bobby Orr did not simply play the position of defenseman better than anyone who came before him. He played it differently. He played it in a way that had never been attempted, never been imagined, never been permitted by the coaches and the systems and the unwritten rules that governed the sport. And to grasp the magnitude of what he did, you have to understand just how rigid those rules were. The defenseman in hockey, from the earliest days of the organized game in the late 1800s through the first several decades of the National Hockey League, was a guardian, a sentry, a player whose primary function was to protect the goal, to break up opposing attacks, and to move the puck forward to the more skilled players who skated up front. The position was defined not by what you could create, but by what you could prevent. A great defenseman was a man who hit hard, who stood firm in front of his own net, who could absorb punishment along the boards and deliver it in equal measure, who could take a pass under pressure and send it cleanly up ice to the forwards without making a mistake. That was the standard, that was the expectation, and for a very long time, from the founding of the NHL in 1917 through the expansion era of the late 1960s, nobody seriously questioned it. In the earliest years of professional hockey, the game itself was structured in ways that reinforced this conservative approach to defense. The forward pass was not fully legalized across all three zones until the 1929-30 season. Before that rule change, the game was built around individual rushes and close-quarters battles near the puck. Passing the puck forward to a teammate in another zone was not allowed. This meant that offensive plays developed slowly, methodically, and the defenseman's job was straightforward in its simplicity. Stand your ground, clear the zone, do not get caught out of position. If the puck comes to you, move it to a forward. If an opposing player comes at you, stop him. The tools of the trade were physical strength, toughness, and positional discipline. Creativity was not part of the job description. The great defensive players of the 1920s and 1930s operated within this framework. Eddie Shaw of the Boston Bruins was perhaps the most famous defenseman of the early NHL era. Shaw was a ferocious competitor, a physical player who could skate and hit and fight with equal intensity. He won the Hart Trophy as the league's most valuable player 4 times, a remarkable achievement for a defenseman in any era. But even Shaw, for all his dominance, was considered a rarity, an anomaly. He was the exception that proved the rule, a defenseman who happened to be talented enough to be the best player on the ice, but who was not expected to be replicated. The position itself did not change because of Eddie Shaw. Coaches did not suddenly decide that all defensemen should be dynamic and offensive. Shaw was Shaw, and everyone else was expected to stay home. After Shaw retired in 1940, the position settled back into its traditional mould. The original 6 era, which stretched from 1942 to 1967, was the golden age of NHL hockey in many ways, a period of intense competition among 6 teams that knew each other intimately and played each other with a ferocity that is difficult to comprehend in the modern era. The Montreal Canadiens, the Toronto Maple Leafs, the Detroit Red Wings, the Boston Bruins, the Chicago Blackhawks, and the New York Rangers. 6 teams, 70 games a season. Every game mattered. Every rivalry was personal. Every player on every roster had earned his place through a brutal process of elimination. During this era, coaches demanded structure above all else. The game was physical, the rosters were small, and mistakes were punished severely. A defenseman who got caught out of position, who ventured too far into the offensive zone, who tried to carry the puck when he should have passed it, was a defenseman who would be benched or sent down to the minor leagues. The coaches of this era Men like Toe Blake of the Canadiens and Punch Imlach of the Maple Leafs were disciplinarians who believed in the system. The system said that forwards scored goals and defensemen prevented them. That was the order of things, and it was not open to negotiation. There were talented defensemen during the original Six era, players who possessed skills that went far beyond simple physicality. Doug Harvey of the Montreal Canadiens was widely regarded as the best defenseman of his generation and one of the best in the history of the sport. Harvey won the Norris Trophy 7 times between 1955 and 1962. He was a player of remarkable intelligence and vision, a man who could read the game several plays ahead and control the tempo of a hockey game from the back end in ways that were almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Harvey would slow the game down when his team needed to regroup and speed it up when the moment was right to attack. He was, in many ways, a quarterback on ice, directing traffic and making decisions that shaped the flow of the game. But even Harvey, for all his brilliance, operated within the traditional boundaries of the position. He was a passer, a distributor, a facilitator. He made the play from behind his own blue line and rarely ventured deep into the offensive zone to finish plays himself. He created opportunities for others, but he did not score at a high rate. His career high in goals was 9 in a single season. His career high in points was 50. These were respectable numbers for a defenseman of his era, but they were the numbers of a man who played within the system, not a man who broke it. Harvey was the best at what defensemen were supposed to do. He did not fundamentally change what defensemen were supposed to be. Red Kelly of the Detroit Red Wings was another player who hinted at the possibilities that a defenseman with offensive talent could offer. Kelly played defense for Detroit from 1947 to 1960 and won the first ever Norris Trophy in the 1953-54 season. He was an exceptional skater, a clean player in a rough era, and he had genuine offensive instincts. In the 1950-51 season, Kelly scored 17 goals, an impressive total for a defenseman at the time. But Kelly's career trajectory told its own story about the limitations of the position. When he was traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1960, the Leafs moved him to centre. They took one of the best defensemen in the league and made him a forward. The message was clear. If you are too offensive for the defensive position, the solution is not to expand the position. The solution is to move you to a different one. The position itself was fixed. Tim Horton of the Toronto Maple Leafs was another elite defenseman of the era, a man of immense physical strength who could also handle the puck with skill. Horton was a 4-time Stanley Cup champion, a reliable, durable presence on the Leafs' blue line for nearly 2 decades. But Horton, too, played within the established framework. He was tough. He was consistent. He was not a revolutionary. Pierre Pilote of the Chicago Blackhawks won the Norris Trophy 3 consecutive times from 1963 to 1965. He was a smart, mobile defenseman who could move the puck effectively and contribute offensively. In his best season, he scored 14 goals and accumulated 64 points. These were strong numbers, the best a defenseman could produce in that era. But they were a fraction of what the top forwards were producing. In the same season that Pilote scored 14 goals, Bobby Hull of the Blackhawks scored 54. The gap between the best defenseman and the best forward was enormous. It was not a gap that anyone expected to close. This was the world of professional hockey in the mid-1960s, a world where the roles were clearly defined and rarely challenged. The forwards were the scorers, the defensemen were the protectors, the goalies were the last line of defense. Each group had its responsibilities, its identity, its place in the hierarchy of the game, and the hierarchy placed the defenseman firmly below the forward in terms of glamour, excitement, and offensive contribution. The physical nature of the game reinforced this hierarchy. Hockey in the original Six era was extraordinarily violent compared to the modern game. With only 6 teams and small rosters, the same players faced each other over and over again, season after season. Feuds developed, grudges were nurtured, fights were common and often brutal. The enforcers of the era were feared and respected in equal measure, and defensemen, by the nature of their position, were expected to be among the toughest players on the ice. They were the ones who had to stand in front of their own net and clear out opposing forwards who crowded the crease. They were the ones who delivered bone-crushing body checks along the boards. They were the ones who dropped their gloves and fought when the code of the game demanded it. A defenseman who was seen too soft, too finesse-oriented, too interested in carrying the puck was a defenseman who would not survive in the NHL. The evolution of goaltending also shaped the defensive position. Before Jacques Plante popularized the goaltender's mask in 1959, goalies played without facial protection. They were extraordinarily vulnerable, and they depended heavily on their defensemen to block shots and keep opposing players away from the front of the net. A defenseman who was caught out of position, who was up in the offensive zone when the play turned the other direction, was leaving his goaltender exposed to danger. This created an unspoken but powerful contract between the defenseman and his goaltender. The defenseman's first duty was to protect the man in the net. Everything else was secondary. The coaching philosophies of the era cemented these ideas into doctrine. Coaches like Toe Blake, who led the Canadiens to 8 Stanley Cups, demanded that his players follow the system without deviation. Punch Imlach, who coached the Leafs to 4 cups in the 1960s, was even more rigid. He wanted his defensemen to stay home, clear the puck, and let the forwards do the scoring. These coaches had grown up in the game. They had absorbed its traditions and its rhythms. They believed in the system because the system had won them championships. A defenseman who wanted to rush the puck was a defenseman who needed to be reminded of his responsibilities or replaced by someone who understood them. The scouting and development systems of the era also reinforced the position's limitations. Young defensemen were identified and developed based on their size, their toughness, and their ability to play a physical game. Skating ability was valued, but it was valued primarily as a tool for staying in position and closing gaps, not for leading offensive rushes. A young defenseman who showed too much interest in offense was often corrected, redirected, told to focus on the defensive side of the game. The system did not produce offensive defensemen because it was not designed to. It produced what the coaches wanted, which was reliable, tough, disciplined players who stayed within the structure. This was the landscape of professional hockey in the autumn of 1966, when an 18-year-old from Parry Sound, Ontario, stepped onto the ice at Boston Garden for the first time. The Boston Bruins were a franchise in crisis. They had not made the playoffs in 8 consecutive seasons. They had finished last or second to last in the 6-team league year after year. They played to half-empty arenas in a city that had grown weary of losing. The great tradition of the Boston Bruins, the legacy of Eddie Shaw and the early glory days, had faded into distant memory. And into this void walked a teenager who would not only save the franchise, but would redefine the very position he played. Bobby Orr did not just play defense differently. He eliminated the boundary between defense and offense entirely. He made the defenseman the most important player on the ice, the player who controlled the game from beginning to end, who could shut down an opposing attack one moment and be leading a 3-on-2 rush into the other team's zone the next. He did not merely break the mold. He shattered it so completely that it could never be reassembled. The position evolution that Bobby Orr triggered was not incremental. It was not a gradual shift over many years. It was sudden, dramatic, and irreversible. Before Bobby Orr, a defenseman who scored 40 points was having a career year. After Bobby Orr, a defenseman who scored 40 points was considered merely adequate. Before Bobby Orr, the defenseman was the anchor of the team, the player who held everything together from behind. After Bobby Orr, the defenseman was the engine, the player who drove everything forward. He changed the geometry of the game. He changed the way coaches thought about deployment and strategy. He changed what young players aspired to be when they put on their skates for the first time. Every defenseman who has played in the NHL since Bobby Orr's arrival has been measured, to some degree, against the standard he set. Paul Coffey, Ray Bourque, Chris Chelios, Brian Lech, Nicholas Lidstrom, Eric Carlson, Cale Makar, all of them are branches of the tree that Bobby Orr planted. All of them are playing a position that Bobby Orr invented, not the old position of defenseman, the one that was about caution and discipline and staying back. The new position, the complete position, the position where you can do everything. And he did it all in a career that lasted, effectively, fewer than 10 full seasons. That is the detail that makes everything else so much heavier, so much more poignant, so much harder to accept. The greatest defenseman who ever lived, the man who redefined the position more profoundly than any single player has ever redefined any position in any professional sport, did not have the luxury of a long career. His knees would not allow it. The very speed that made him transcendent, the very explosiveness that left defenders grasping at empty air, the very willingness to throw his body into every play, regardless of the consequences, also made him fragile. And the game that he loved, the game that gave him everything, and that he gave everything to in return, would ultimately take his legs from him. But before we reach that part of the story, before we confront the cost of genius, we need to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to Parry Sound. Back to the frozen ponds and the cold arenas where a boy who was smaller than most of his peers, but faster than all of them, first learned that the puck was something to be controlled, something to be cherished, something to be carried up the ice like a precious gift. The deeper story of Bobby Orr begins not on the grand stage of the NHL, but in the silence of a Canadian winter, where the only sound was the scrape of blades on ice and the crack of a wooden stick against frozen rubber. That story is where we turn next. But before we leave this chapter of context, there is more that must be understood about the hockey world Bobby Orr was about to enter, because the transformation he caused did not happen in a vacuum. The league itself was on the verge of its own transformation, and the collision of Bobby Orr's talent with the forces of change that were reshaping professional hockey would produce something that neither side could have anticipated. In 1967, the NHL expanded from 6 teams to 12. The league doubled in size overnight, adding the Philadelphia Flyers, the Pittsburgh Penguins, the St. Louis Blues, the Minnesota North Stars, the Los Angeles Kings, and the Oakland Seals. It was the most dramatic structural change in the league's 50-year history, and it fundamentally altered the competitive landscape. The talent pool was spread thinner. Rosters that had been packed with skilled players during the original 6 era now had gaps and weaknesses. Depth became a luxury, and in this new environment, a transcendent individual talent could have an even greater impact than before. This is the context that matters. Bobby Orr arrived in the NHL the season before expansion. He spent his rookie year in the old 6-team league, facing the concentrated talent of the traditional powers. And then, starting in his second season, he played in an expanded league where the overall level of competition, particularly among the newer teams, was lower. This does not diminish his achievements. What he did against the best teams in the league, against the Canadiens and the Blackhawks and the Rangers, was as dominant as what he did against anyone else. But the expansion era gave him a larger stage, a wider audience, and more opportunities to showcase the revolutionary style of play that was changing everything. The expansion also changed the way hockey was consumed by the public. Television contracts expanded. The game reached new markets across the United States. For the first time, hockey was being watched by millions of people who had never seen a game in person, who had no connection to the traditional hockey cities of Montreal and Toronto and Detroit. These new fans needed a star, someone who could embody the excitement and the beauty of the sport in a way that translated through a television screen. Bobby Orr was that star. There was something about the way Bobby moved on the ice that was uniquely suited to the visual medium of television. His rushes were not just fast, they were elegant. He carried the puck with a fluidity that made the game look effortless, even though it was anything but. He weaved through traffic with a grace that recalled figure skating more than hockey. He made sudden, explosive changes of direction that left defenders stumbling and falling. And when he scored, which he did with increasing frequency as his career progressed, the goals were often spectacular. End-to-end rushes that began behind his own net and finished with the puck in the back of the opposing net. These were the kinds of plays that made people lean forward in their chairs, that made them call their friends and tell them to turn on the television. Bobby Orr was not just good for hockey, he was good for the business of hockey. The tactical implications of expansion were also significant. With 12 teams instead of 6, coaches had less time to prepare for individual opponents. Scouting was less thorough, game plans were less specific. In the original Six era, teams played each other 14 times a season. Coaches knew every player on every opposing roster. They knew their tendencies, their weaknesses, their habits. In the expanded league, teams faced some opponents only 4 or 6 times a season. There was less familiarity, less preparation, and more room for a supremely talented player to exploit the gaps. For defensemen specifically, the expansion created new dynamics. The newer teams often had less talent on their blue lines, which meant that the contrast between an elite defenseman like Bobby Orr and the average defenseman in the league was even more pronounced. When Bobby carried the puck up the ice against an expansion team's defense, the skill gap was enormous. He was operating at a level that most defensemen, even competent ones, simply could not match. But it was not just about the skill gap. It was about the philosophical shift that Bobby Orr represented. His presence in the league forced coaches to reconsider their assumptions about how the game should be played. If a defenseman could carry the puck and create offense more effectively than any forward on the team, then the traditional division of labor between forwards and defensemen no longer made sense. The entire structure of the game had to be rethought. Some coaches adapted. Parry Sound, who coached the Bruins during Bobby's peak years, built his system around Bobby's ability to create offense from the back end. He gave Bobby the freedom to roam, to carry the puck, to jump into the play whenever his instincts told him to. The result was one of the most exciting teams in hockey history. The Bruins of the late 1960s and early 1970s were a dynamic, high-scoring machine, and Bobby Orr was the engine that drove it. Other coaches resisted. They clung to the traditional model, insisting that their defensemen stay home and play a conservative game. These coaches watched as their teams fell behind, outskated and outscored by a Bruins team that was playing a fundamentally different style of hockey. Some eventually adapted. Others were replaced by coaches who understood the new reality. Either way, the game was changing, and Bobby Orr was the reason. The ripple effects extended far beyond the NHL. At the junior hockey level, coaches began to look for defensemen who could skate and handle the puck. The old model, which prioritized size and toughness above all else, began to give way to a new model that valued mobility and skill. Young players, who might have been told 10 years earlier to focus on hitting and shot blocking, were now being encouraged to develop their skating and their puck handling. The next generation of defensemen, the ones who grew up watching Bobby Orr on television, would enter the league with a fundamentally different understanding of what the position could be. At the international level, the impact was equally profound. The Canadian hockey establishment had long viewed the Soviet and European styles of play with suspicion. The Soviets, in particular, played a wide-open, puck-possession game that emphasized skating and passing over physical play. Canadian hockey traditionalists dismissed this style as soft, as unsuited to the demands of real hockey. But Bobby Orr's style, which was undeniably Canadian in its origins and its intensity, shared certain qualities with the European approach. He valued puck possession. He valued skating ability. He valued creativity. He demonstrated that you could play a dynamic, skill-based style without sacrificing toughness or competitiveness. In this way, he served as a bridge between the Canadian and European traditions, a player who proved that the best hockey was a synthesis of both approaches. The position of defenseman, before Bobby Orr, was a dead end in terms of individual recognition and glory. Defensemen were the supporting cast, the unsung heroes, the players who did the dirty work so that the forwards could shine. The great defensemen of the past were respected within the hockey community, but they were not household names outside of it. Doug Harvey was revered by hockey people, but he was not famous in the way that Maurice Richard or Gordie Howe were famous. The defenseman was invisible to the casual fan. Bobby Orr changed that. He made the defenseman the star. He made the defenseman the player that fans came to see, the player whose name they knew, the player whose jersey they wore. He brought the position out of the shadows and into the spotlight. And that spotlight, once it was turned on, never went off. Every great defenseman who has played since Bobby Orr has benefited from the visibility he created. The position is now recognized as one of the most important and most glamorous in the sport. The Norris Trophy, which was once a relatively obscure award, is now one of the most prestigious individual honors in hockey. And all of that traces back to a teenager from Parry Sound who stepped onto the ice at Boston Garden in 1966 and played the game in a way that no one had ever seen before. The full story of how he did it and what it cost him begins in the next chapter. That is the weight of the context. That is the depth of the tradition Bobby Orr was born into and born to shatter. A tradition that stretched back decades, that was reinforced by every coach and every system and every unwritten rule the sport had ever known. A tradition that said a defenseman defends and nothing more. Bobby Orr walked into that tradition at 18 years old and, within a few short seasons, made it obsolete. Robert Gordon Orr was born on the 20th of March 1948 in Parry Sound, Ontario. It was a town of roughly 6,000 people, nestled against the shores of Georgian Bay, about 150 miles north of Toronto. The landscape was rugged and beautiful, a place of dense forests and cold blue water, and winters that arrived early and lingered long into the spring. Was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked at night, where children roamed freely through the streets and the fields, and where hockey was not merely a sport, but an organizing principle of community life. When the temperatures dropped and the ponds froze over, the town came alive with the sound of sticks and blades and laughter. Hockey was the heartbeat of Parry Sound, and it was the heartbeat of the Orr household. Bobby's father, Doug Orr, had been a capable hockey player in his own day. Good enough, according to some accounts, to have drawn the attention of professional scouts when he was a young man. There were reports that he had been invited to attend a tryout camp affiliated with the Boston Bruins organization. But the timing was wrong. The Second World War intervened, and Doug served in the Canadian Navy rather than pursuing a hockey career. When the war ended, he returned to Parry Sound, married a woman named Ava, and settled into the rhythms of small-town working life. He held various jobs over the years, including a position at a local explosives plant. He was a quiet man, not given to boasting or grand pronouncements, but he understood hockey at a deep level. He had played it seriously. He knew what talent looked like. And from the earliest days of his son's life on the ice, he knew that Bobby possessed something rare. Bobby's mother, Ava, was the steady center of a growing family. She kept the household running, managed the finances, and provided the emotional stability that allowed her children to thrive. The Orr family eventually included 5 children, and Bobby was the third. Like many families in small-town Ontario in the post-war years, the Orrs were not affluent. Money was a constant concern, a background hum of worry that influenced decisions large and small. But hockey, in its most essential form, cost almost nothing: a frozen pond, a pair of skates, even if they were second-hand and a size too big, a stick whittled down or borrowed, and time. In Parry Sound in winter there was always time. Bobby first stood on skates at the age of 4. His older siblings were already skating, and Bobby, unwilling to be left out of anything, demanded to join them. His first pair of skates were hand-me-downs, oversized, with newspaper stuffed into the toes to keep them from sliding around on his small feet. It was not an auspicious beginning. But from the moment Bobby stepped onto the ice, something was different. He did not wobble. He did not cling to the boards. He stood up and he skated, moving across the frozen surface, with a balance and a confidence that startled his parents and the other adults who happened to be watching. It was as though the ice was his natural environment, as though he had been born to exist on that slippery, unforgiving surface. Within a year, Bobby was playing organized hockey in the Parry Sound minor hockey system. He was 5 years old, competing against boys his own age, and occasionally against boys who were a year or 2 older. The coaches noticed him immediately, not because he was bigger or stronger than the other children. He was neither. Bobby was small for his age, wiry and slight, lacking the bulk that usually translated into dominance in youth hockey. What he had was speed, extraordinary, almost shocking speed for a child that young. He could skate faster than boys 2 and 3 years older. He could change direction on a whim, pivoting and turning, with an ease that suggested an instinctive mastery of the mechanics of skating. And he had something else, something harder to define, but impossible to miss. He understood the game. Most children playing hockey at the age of 5 or 6 do what children do in every team sport at that age. They swarm. They chase the puck in a pack, crowding around it, hacking at it, creating a chaotic scrum of small bodies and flailing sticks. Bobby did not do this. Bobby positioned himself away from the scrum, in the open spaces of the ice, waiting for the puck to emerge, and when it did, he was there. He received it, controlled it, and moved with it up the ice, his head up, his eyes scanning for teammates, already thinking 2 and 3 plays ahead. This kind of spatial awareness, this ability to see the game as a chessboard rather than a foot race, is the hallmark of hockey intelligence. Most players develop it gradually over years of practice and competition. Bobby Orr had it at age 5. By the time Bobby was 8, the coaches in Parry Sound had a problem. He was too good for his age group. Playing against boys his own age had become pointless. There was no competition, no challenge, no development happening. So they moved him up. They put him on a team with 10 and 11-year-olds. Bobby adjusted within a game or two and then resumed dominating. So they moved him up again. By the time he was 10, Bobby was playing with boys who were 12 and 13. By the time he was 12, he was playing with and against boys who were 14 and 15. At every level, the pattern repeated itself. A brief period of adjustment, during which the older, bigger players tried to use their physical advantage to slow him down, followed by Bobby's inevitable ascent to the top of the competition. He absorbed the hits, he got knocked down, he got back up, and then he skated around the players who had knocked him down and scored. The adults in the Parry Sound hockey community began to realize that they were witnessing something beyond the normal range of talented youth hockey players. This was not simply a good young player. This was a prodigy. Stories about the boy from Parry Sound began to circulate through the broader Ontario hockey community, passed from coach to coach, from scout to scout, from one winter arena to another. The hockey grapevine was extensive and efficient, and word travelled quickly when a player of unusual ability appeared. The system for developing hockey talent in Canada during this era was fundamentally different from the modern system. There was no universal entry draft, which would not be established until 1963. Instead, professional teams claimed the rights to young players through a sponsorship arrangement. An NHL club would sponsor a junior hockey team, providing financial support and resources, and in exchange, the club gained exclusive negotiating rights to the players on that junior team's roster. It was a system that benefited the professional organizations far more than the players or their families. A boy of 12 or 13 could effectively have his professional future determined by which organization happened to sponsor the junior team he played for. There was little negotiating power for the player and almost no freedom of movement. The Boston Bruins were the organization that recognized Bobby Orr's potential first and moved most aggressively to secure his rights. Their scouting network had identified the boy from Parry Sound, and they dispatched scouts to Georgian Bay to observe him in person. What the scouts reported back confirmed every rumor and exceeded every expectation. The Bruins acted quickly, establishing a financial relationship with the junior team Bobby would eventually join and beginning the process of building a connection with the Orr family. It was a calculated investment in the future, and for a franchise that had been struggling on the ice for years, it was perhaps the most important investment in the organization's history. At the age of 14, Bobby Orr left Parry Sound. He packed his belongings, said goodbye to his family, and travelled south to Oshawa, Ontario, where he would play for the Oshawa Generals of the Ontario Hockey Association. The OHA was the top junior hockey league in Canada, the proving ground where the best young players in the country competed against each other in preparation for professional careers. Bobby would live with a billet family in Oshawa, attend school during the day, and play hockey at night and on weekends. He would be competing against players who were 17, 18, and 19 years old. He was 14, barely into his teenage years, and he was leaving home for the first time. The homesickness was immediate and profound. Bobby was a shy boy, reserved by nature, not the kind of gregarious personality who made friends quickly in new environments. He missed his parents. He missed his siblings. He missed the familiar rhythms of Parry Sound, the small-town comfort of knowing every face and every street. Oshawa was larger, louder, unfamiliar. The Billet family was kind, but they were strangers. The other players on the Generals were older, tougher, and not immediately welcoming to a 14-year-old who was receiving more attention from scouts and media than most of them would receive in their entire careers. The junior hockey environment could be harsh. Hazing was common. The older players tested the younger ones, and Bobby, as the most heavily scouted prospect in the league, was singled out for particular attention, both on and off the ice. But Bobby endured. He kept quiet. He worked hard. He absorbed the loneliness and the physical punishment, and he channeled everything he felt into his performance on the ice. Because on the ice, the pain went away. On the ice, the homesickness disappeared. On the ice, he was in control. In his first season with the Oshawa Generals, the 1962-63 season, Bobby scored 6 goals and added 15 assists for 21 points in 34 games. For a 14-year-old playing in a league designed for players who were 4 and 5 years older, these were remarkable numbers. But the statistics told only part of the story. What made the deepest impression on those who watched Bobby that season was the quality and the nature of his play. He did not play like a 14-year-old. He did not play like a young defenseman learning his craft. He played with an authority and a vision that seemed to belong to a veteran of many years. He carried the puck with confidence, led rushes from end to end, made passes that split defenses wide open, and demonstrated a defensive awareness that belied his tender age. Each season that followed brought improvement, both in the statistics and in the completeness of his game. His second year was markedly better than his first. His third year was better than his second. The trajectory was steep and consistent, a steady climb toward a level of dominance that junior hockey had never seen from a defenseman. By the 1964-65 season, Bobby was the best player in the Ontario Hockey Association, a distinction that was not contested by anyone who watched the league regularly. Opposing coaches designed their entire defensive strategies around the singular goal of containing Bobby Orr. And most of the time, those strategies failed. In his final full season of junior hockey, 1965-66, Bobby reached a pinnacle of individual performance that was staggering by any standard. He scored 38 goals and added 56 assists for 94 points in just 47 games. These numbers, from a defenseman at any level of hockey, were unprecedented. No defenseman in the history of junior hockey in Canada had ever come close to those totals. Bobby was not merely good. He was not merely the best defenseman in the league. He was the best player in the league, full stop, playing a position that was traditionally defined by its limitations, and making those limitations seem like an absurd relic of a less imaginative era. And it gets harder from here, because beneath the brilliance, beneath the records and the accolades and the growing certainty that Bobby Orr was going to transform professional hockey, there was a shadow. His left knee, which had been injured during his junior career, was not right. The cartilage, the smooth, protective tissue that cushions the bones of the knee joint and allows it to function smoothly under stress, had been damaged. In the mid-1960s, the understanding of knee injuries in athletes was primitive by modern standards. There were no MRI machines. There were no arthroscopic surgical techniques. The options for treating damaged cartilage were limited and crude, often involving the removal of the damaged tissue rather than its repair. Bobby was aware of the pain in his knee. He played through it because that was what hockey players did. The culture of the sport demanded stoicism. It demanded toughness. It demanded that you played unless you physically could not stand up. Bobby could still stand up. He could still skate faster than anyone in the building, so he played. In the autumn of 1966, Bobby signed his first professional contract with the Boston Bruins. The negotiations were conducted by Alan Eagleson, a young Toronto lawyer who had been introduced to the Orr family and who would go on to become one of the most powerful and ultimately most disgraced figures in the history of hockey. Eagleson negotiated a 2-year deal worth approximately $75,000, a sum that was unprecedented for a rookie in any professional sport. The contract was a declaration of faith by the Bruins organization. They were not just signing a talented young player, they were making a bet that this 18-year-old from Parry Sound was going to save their franchise. Bobby Orr played his first NHL game on October 19, 1966, against the Detroit Red Wings at Boston Garden. The old building, with its steep balconies and its low ceiling that trapped the noise and the cigarette smoke and the cold, was not full. The Bruins had been so consistently awful for so many years that the fans of Boston had turned their attention to the Red Sox, the Celtics, and the Patriots. Hockey was an afterthought in a city that should have been a hockey stronghold. But the people who were present that October night witnessed the arrival of something extraordinary. Bobby played with composure and confidence. He recorded an assist. He was physical along the boards. He jumped into the rush at every opportunity. He skated with a speed and a grace that made the ice seem too small for him. After the game, the reporters who covered the Bruins, men who had grown accustomed to writing about a losing team, scrambled for the right words to describe what they had seen. His rookie season produced 13 goals, 28 assists, and 41 points in 61 games. He won the Calder Trophy as the league's best rookie. The numbers were excellent for a defenseman, but they were not the point. The point was the transformation of the franchise and of the city. Attendance at Boston Garden began to rise. The energy in the building went from listless to electric. People who had not watched a Bruins game in years started showing up again, drawn by the reports of this extraordinary teenager who was playing a brand of hockey that no one had ever seen before. Bobby's skating was the first thing that stopped you. He was faster than any defenseman in the history of the league. He could go from a dead stop to full speed in 3 strides, and once he was at full speed, he was almost impossible to catch. His straight-line speed was devastating, but his agility was equally remarkable. He could change direction at velocity, cutting inside or outside a checker, pivoting on one skate, accelerating out of turns, all while maintaining perfect control of the puck. His edge work, the way he used the blades of his skates to grip and carve the ice surface, was the finest anyone had ever seen. Then there was his vision. Bobby Orr did not just see the ice. He processed it at a higher speed than anyone else. He saw passing lanes before they existed. He anticipated where players would be, not where they were. He was always 3 plays ahead, his mind racing through possibilities and outcomes, while his body executed the current play with mechanical precision. When he picked up the puck behind his own net and began to skate, the geometry of the entire rink shifted. Defenders backed up, uncertain. Forwards broke for open ice. The play opened up in front of him like a flower unfolding, and Bobby moved through it with the calm certainty of a man who already knew how the story ended. The Bruins coach, Parry Sound, made the critical decision early in Bobby's career to give him complete freedom on the ice. Sound recognized that attempting to constrain Bobby within a traditional defensive system would be not only futile but counterproductive. Bobby was not a conventional defenseman. He was something new, something the game had never produced before, and the only rational response was to build the team around him. Sound did exactly that, and the results were immediate. The Bruins went from last place to contention within 2 seasons, powered by Bobby's ability to control the game from the back end in ways that no one had previously imagined possible. The physical dimension of Bobby's game, while less celebrated than his offensive brilliance, was equally important. He was not a fighter in the traditional sense, though he was willing to drop his gloves when the situation demanded it. What he was, fundamentally, was brave. He blocked shots. He stood his ground in front of his own net. He absorbed hits from players who were often bigger and stronger than he was, and he kept going. There was a toughness to Bobby Orr that was easy to overlook because his skill was so overwhelming, but it was essential to who he was as a player. He was not a finesse player who avoided contact. He was a complete player who embraced every aspect of the game, including the physical punishment that came with playing in the NHL during one of its most violent eras. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a time of extraordinary physicality in professional hockey. Fights were common. Stick work was rampant. Body checks were delivered with a ferocity that would draw suspensions and fines in the modern game, but were considered routine in that era. Bobby played through all of it. He was cross-checked in the back. He was slashed across the arms and the ankles. He was grabbed and held and interfered with on virtually every shift. Opposing teams made it their explicit strategy to hit Bobby as often and as hard as possible, hoping to slow him down through accumulated physical punishment. It rarely worked. Bobby absorbed the punishment, picked himself up, and continued to play at a level that no one else could match. His teammates adored him. This is a detail that gets overlooked in the statistical analysis and the historical retrospectives, but it matters enormously. Bobby Orr was beloved by the men who played alongside him, not just because of his talent, but because of his character. He was generous with the puck, always looking for the pass that would give a teammate a better scoring chance rather than taking the shot himself. He was selfless in his defensive responsibilities, willing to sacrifice his body to block a shot or break up a play. He was supportive of his teammates, offering encouragement rather than criticism, building them up rather than tearing them down. In a dressing room full of strong personalities and competitive egos, Bobby was the unifying presence, the player that everyone respected and everyone wanted to play alongside. Phil Esposito, who was Bobby's most frequent and most productive partner on the ice, has spoken many times about what it was like to play with him. Esposito has described the experience as almost surreal, saying that Bobby did things with the puck that seemed physically impossible, that he made passes that no one else would have even attempted, and that playing alongside him made everyone on the team better. Esposito scored more than 700 goals in his NHL career, and he has acknowledged that a significant number of them, perhaps as many as a quarter or a third, were the direct result of Bobby Orr's playmaking. Bobby created scoring opportunities the way a painter creates art, with vision and precision, and an understanding of space and timing that was unique in the history of the sport. The Bruins teams of the late 1960s and early 1970s were not one-man teams. They were stacked with talent. Esposito was a generational goalscorer. John Busick was a durable, productive winger who would eventually score more than 500 career goals. Ken Hodge was a skilled power forward. Wayne Cashman was a tough, gritty player who protected his teammates and contributed offensively. Jerry Cheevers was a charismatic and capable goaltender. These were excellent players, many of whom would go on to be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. But they would all tell you, without hesitation, that Bobby Orr was the reason the Bruins won. He was the catalyst. He was the engine. He was the player who elevated everyone around him simply by being on the ice. The transformation of Boston was not merely a sporting story. It was a civic awakening. Before Bobby Orr, the Bruins were an afterthought in a city that prided itself on its sports culture. The Red Sox had Ted Williams. The Celtics had Bill Russell. The Patriots, though struggling on the field, still commanded attention. Hockey was the forgotten sport, the game that filled seats only when there was nothing else to do on a cold winter night. Bobby changed all of that, not gradually, but with the force of a revelation. Within 2 seasons of his arrival, the Bruins were the hottest ticket in Boston. The old Garden, which had been half empty for years, was suddenly sold out for every home game. The crowds were louder, younger, and more passionate than anything the building had ever experienced. The balcony seats, which were the cheapest in the house and the most precarious, were packed with working-class fans who recognized in Bobby something that transcended the game itself. He was one of them. He was a kid from a small town who had been given an extraordinary gift, and who used that gift with an honesty and a ferocity that resonated with people who worked hard and expected others to do the same. The second season, 1967-68, brought further evidence that the Bruins were becoming something special. Bobby recorded 31 assists and 41 points, despite missing some time due to his troublesome knee. More importantly, the team made the playoffs for the first time in nearly a decade. The people of Boston responded as though their team had won the championship. The excitement was palpable, electric, a collective recognition that the years of futility were ending and that something wonderful was beginning. Bobby was at the center of it all, the young star around whom the franchise was being rebuilt. The 1968-69 season was the year Bobby began to dominate the league in a way that defied historical precedent. He scored 21 goals, an impressive number for a defenseman, and added 43 assists for 64 points. He won his second consecutive Norris Trophy, establishing himself not just as the best young defenseman in hockey, but as the best defenseman, period. His defensive play was maturing rapidly. He was learning to read the offensive patterns of opposing teams with increasing precision, to anticipate passes and breakouts before they happened, to use his speed not just to attack but to recover and defend. The complete player was emerging, and the hockey world watched with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The Bruins organization, recognizing that they had the foundation for a championship team, made shrewd additions around Bobby. The acquisition of Phil Esposito, Ken Hodge, and Fred Stanfield from Chicago in the famous 1967 trade was perhaps the most important roster move in franchise history. Esposito, in particular, was the perfect complement to Bobby. While Bobby controlled the game from the back end, orchestrating the play with his passing and his rushes, Esposito positioned himself in front of the opposing net and converted the chances that Bobby created. Their partnership was not merely productive, it was symbiotic. Each made the other better. Each understood the other's instincts and movements in a way that seemed almost telepathic. Esposito would drift to the slot. Bobby would find him with a pass that threaded through 3 defenders, and the puck would be in the net before the goaltender could react. They did it again and again, night after night, with a consistency that bordered on the mechanical. The city embraced not just the team, but the culture that surrounded it. The Big Bad Bruins, as they came to be known, played a style that was equal parts artistry and intimidation. Bobby provided the artistry. Players like Ted Green, Don Orey, and later Wayne Cashman and Terry O'Reilly provided the toughness. The Bruins were skilled enough to beat you with passing and scoring, and tough enough to beat you with physicality and aggression. No team in hockey wanted to play them. The combination of Bobby's transcendent talent and the team's collective ferocity made the Bruins the most feared team in the league, and through it all, Bobby remained the same person he had been when he arrived from Parry Sound. He was quiet in the dressing room. He let his play speak for him. He was unfailingly polite with fans and reporters, though he guarded his privacy fiercely. He did not court attention or seek the spotlight. Fame had been thrust upon him, and he wore it uncomfortably, like a suit that did not quite fit. His teammates noticed this and respected it. They protected him, not just on the ice but off it, shielding him from the demands of celebrity and allowing him the space to be the private, introverted young man he truly was. The trajectory continued upward. The third season brought 21 goals and 64 points, and then came 1969-70, Bobby's 4th year, the year that rewrote the record books and redefined the sport. He scored 33 goals and added 87 assists for 120 points. 120 points from a defenseman. The previous record for a defenseman was 65 points. Bobby exceeded it by 55. It was not a record broken. It was a conceptual barrier destroyed. He won everything. The Norris Trophy, the Hart Trophy, the Art Ross Trophy as the league's leading scorer, a feat no defenseman has ever replicated. And in the playoffs, he led the Bruins to the Stanley Cup, sweeping the St. Louis Blues in 4 games. The overtime goal in Game 4, on May 10, 1970, produced the photograph that would become the most famous image in hockey history. Bobby, airborne, arms raised, face illuminated with pure joy. He was 22 years old. He had just completed the greatest individual season in the history of professional hockey. And for one brief, radiant moment, the future seemed to stretch before him without limit. But here's what makes this story unforgettable. The first thing that must be understood about what came after that glorious spring night in 1970 is the nature of what Bobby Orr was playing through. Because the story of Bobby Orr is not simply a story of what he achieved on the ice. It is equally, and perhaps more importantly, a story of what his body endured while he achieved it. The knees. Always the knees. They are the dark thread that runs through every brilliant season, every spectacular goal, every standing ovation. They are the thing that makes the triumph inseparable from the tragedy. The knee problems had begun in junior hockey, as we have discussed. By the time Bobby reached the NHL at the age of 18, his left knee was already compromised. The cartilage, which in a healthy knee provides a smooth, cushioning surface between the bones of the joint, had been damaged, and in the 1960s, the medical options for dealing with cartilage damage were crude. The primary treatment was surgical removal of the damaged tissue. There was no arthroscopic surgery, no minimally invasive technique. The knee was opened up, the damaged cartilage was cut away, and the joint was closed back up. The patient was told to rest, to rehabilitate, and to return to activity. But the fundamental problem was not solved. Once cartilage is removed, it does not regenerate. The joint is left with less cushioning, less protection, less ability to absorb the forces that skating and playing hockey impose upon it. Each surgery took something away that could never be returned. Bobby had his first knee surgery before his 20th birthday, in the summer of 1968, after his second NHL season. The operation was performed to remove damaged cartilage from the left knee. He came back the following season and played brilliantly, recording 64 points and winning his second consecutive Norris Trophy. But the knee was not the same. It swelled after games. It ached during practices. There were mornings when Bobby could barely walk down a flight of stairs. And yet, when game time came, he was there. He always showed up. He always played. The pain was his companion, and he had learned to coexist with it. The 1970-71 season, the year after the first Stanley Cup, was another masterpiece of individual performance. Bobby scored 37 goals and added 102 assists for 139 points. 139. That number stands as the single-season record for a defenseman in NHL history, and it has stood for more than 50 years. To appreciate its magnitude, consider that the second highest single-season point total for a defenseman is 138, achieved by Paul Coffey of the Edmonton Oilers in the 1985-86 season. Coffey achieved that number while playing alongside Wayne Gretzky and Mark Messier on arguably the most offensively talented team in NHL history. Bobby achieved his 139 on a Bruins team that was very good, stocked with talented players like Phil Esposito and John Busick and Ken Hodge, but was not the Oilers. The record has an added weight because of the context in which it was set. Bobby won the Norris Trophy that season for the fourth consecutive time. He won the Hart Trophy for the second consecutive time. He was the most dominant individual force in professional hockey, and there was no one who was even close to challenging him. But the Bruins did not win the Stanley Cup that spring. They were eliminated in the first round of the playoffs by the Montreal Canadiens, a result that remains one of the most shocking upsets in NHL postseason history. The Bruins had finished the regular season with 121 points, the best record in the league by a comfortable margin. The Canadiens had barely qualified for the playoffs. It should not have been a contest. But Montreal had a secret weapon, a young goaltender named Ken Dryden, who had played only 6 regular season games before being thrust into the starting role for the playoffs. Dryden was tall, athletic, and supremely composed under pressure. He played the series of his life against the Bruins, stopping shot after shot after shot, frustrating the most prolific offense in the league. Bobby played well in the series. He was brilliant at times, but Dryden was better and the Canadiens won in 7 games. It was a painful reminder that hockey is a team sport, and that even the greatest individual player cannot win alone. Not when the opposing goaltender decides to be unbeatable. The loss to Montreal was a turning point of sorts, not in Bobby's individual trajectory, which continued to ascend, but in the narrative of the Bruins dynasty. The team that many expected to dominate the NHL for years had been upset by an opponent they should have beaten easily. The window of opportunity, which had seemed so wide open after the 1970 Cup, was beginning to narrow. The Bruins would get another chance, but the sense of invincibility was gone. That second chance came in the 1971-72 season. Bobby was again magnificent, scoring 37 goals and 80 assists for 117 points. The Bruins were again the best team in the league, a powerful physical squad that combined Bobby's transcendent skill with the scoring prowess of Phil Esposito, the toughness of players like Wayne Cashman and Don Marcotte, and the solidity of goalkeeper Jerry Cheevers. They stormed through the regular season and into the playoffs, with the focused intensity of a team determined to avenge the previous year's upset. The partnership between Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito deserves its own examination, because it was one of the most productive and significant partnerships in hockey history. Esposito was a big center, standing 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighing over 200 pounds, with an extraordinary ability to score from close range. He was not the fastest skater, and he was not the most elegant player. What he was, more than almost anyone who has ever played the game, was a finisher. He had an uncanny ability to position himself in front of the opposing net, in the area that hockey people call the slot, and convert passes into goals. His hand-eye coordination was remarkable. His ability to find the smallest opening in a goaltender's armor was almost preternatural. And Bobby Orr, with his ability to carry the puck into the offensive zone and create chances out of nothing, was the perfect complement. Bobby would pick up the puck behind his own net, accelerate through the neutral zone, and enter the offensive zone with speed and purpose. Opposing defensemen would scramble to contain him, collapsing toward the puck, leaving spaces in front of the net. And there, waiting patiently in those spaces, would be Phil Esposito. Bobby would find him with a pass, sometimes a simple direct feed, sometimes a creative bank pass off the boards, sometimes a no-look dish that seemed to defy spatial awareness. And Esposito would finish, goal after goal after goal. In the 1970-71 season, Esposito scored 76 goals, a record that would stand until Wayne Gretzky broke it a decade later. A significant percentage of those goals were the direct result of Bobby Orr's playmaking from the blue line. In the 1972 Stanley Cup Final, the Bruins faced the New York Rangers. It was a compelling matchup between two original six rivals, and the series was physical and intense. But the Bruins, powered by Orr and Esposito and the depth of talent throughout their roster, prevailed in 6 games. Bobby was awarded the Conn Smythe Trophy as the most valuable player of the playoffs for the second time in 3 years. He was 24 years old. He had 2 Stanley Cup championships, 2 Conn Smythe trophies, 3 Hart trophies, 5 consecutive Norris trophies. The accumulation of individual honors was staggering, and it had been achieved in only 6 NHL seasons. The numbers are striking, not just for their magnitude, but for their concentration. Bobby Orr had compressed what would have been a historically great career for any player into a span of 6 years. He had won everything that could be won, broken every record that could be broken, and established a standard of excellence that seemed beyond the reach of any future player. And he had done it all while his body was slowly, quietly, inexorably breaking down. Between the 1972 Cup victory and the start of the following season, Bobby went under the knife again. Another surgery on the left knee, more damaged cartilage removed, more recovery time, more uncertainty about whether the joint could sustain the extraordinary demands that Bobby placed upon it every time he stepped onto the ice. He was 24 years old and had already undergone multiple major knee surgeries. The medical professionals who treated him could see the deterioration. The joint was wearing away. Each surgery helped in the short term, buying a few months of reduced pain and improved mobility. But in the long term, each surgery brought him closer to the end. Bobby came back for the 1972-73 season and was still brilliant. 29 goals, 72 assists, 101 points in 63 games. But that last number was the one that told the most honest story. 63 games. He had missed 15 games due to injury. The absences were becoming more frequent, the recoveries longer, the periods of full health shorter. The knee was dictating the terms of his career now, and Bobby had no choice but to comply. The September 1972 Summit Series between Canada and the Soviet Union stands as one of the most important events in hockey history, and Bobby Orr's absence from it remains one of the great what-ifs of the sport. The series was conceived as a showcase of Canadian hockey supremacy, a chance for the best professional players in Canada to demonstrate their superiority over the Soviet national team. It became something far more dramatic than anyone anticipated, a cultural and political confrontation that gripped both nations and pushed the players involved to the limits of their physical and emotional endurance. Bobby Orr was named to Team Canada. He was expected to be the cornerstone of the team's defense, the player around whom the entire Canadian strategy would be built. But his knee would not cooperate. The injury was too severe, the risk of further damage too great. Bobby travelled with the team but could not play. He watched the 8-game series from a seat rather than from the ice, serving as a member of the team in name and spirit, but unable to contribute where it mattered most. It was a devastating blow, both personally for Bobby and practically for a Canadian team that desperately needed his talent. The series went the full 8 games, with Canada trailing at various points and the outcome uncertain until the final minute. Paul Henderson scored the winning goal with 34 seconds remaining in the 8th game, securing a narrow Canadian victory that was celebrated across the country with an intensity that surprised even the players involved. But many observers, both at the time and in the decades since, have wondered how different the series might have been with a healthy Bobby Orr on the blue line. The Soviets had exposed weaknesses in the Canadian defense throughout the series. Bobby Orr would have addressed many of those weaknesses. Whether his presence would have changed the outcome is impossible to know, but the speculation has never stopped. The 1973-74 season saw Bobby play 74 games and produce 122 points, including 32 goals and 90 assists. He won his 5th consecutive Hart Trophy. He won his 7th consecutive Norris Trophy. He was still, when healthy, the most dominant player in the game. But the qualifier had become impossible to ignore. When healthy, those 2 words now preceded every discussion of Bobby Orr's capabilities. He was the greatest player in the world when healthy, but the periods of health were growing shorter, and the periods of pain and limitation were growing longer. The knee was being drained regularly between games, a procedure in which a physician inserted a needle into the swollen joint and extracted the excess fluid that had accumulated as a result of the inflammation. It was a painful procedure, and it provided only temporary relief. The underlying structural damage remained and was worsening. Each game Bobby played, each stride he took, each check he absorbed or delivered, ground the bones of his left knee together with less and less cushioning between them. He was, in the most literal sense, playing himself into disability. The 1974-75 season was Bobby's last full campaign. He appeared in 80 games, the most he had played in a single season since his 4th year in the league, and his performance was remarkable even by his own extraordinary standards. He scored 46 goals, the most of his career, and added 89 assists for 135 points. He won his 8th consecutive Norris Trophy, extending a streak of dominance at his position that has no parallel in the history of the award, or, arguably, in the history of any individual award in professional sports. 8 consecutive years as the best defenseman in hockey. 8 consecutive years in which no other defenseman came close to challenging him. But the body was failing. Bobby underwent yet another surgery in the summer of 1975. His 6th knee operation. He was 27 years old, an age at which most elite athletes are entering the prime of their careers. Bobby Orr was instead entering the final painful chapter of his. The 1975-76 season brought only 10 games. The knee could not take it. Bobby played when he could, missed weeks at a time, tried to come back, and found that the joint would not cooperate. He was a shadow of the player he had been, limited in his movement, unable to generate the explosive speed that had been his greatest weapon. The Bruins, and the entire hockey world, began to come to terms with the reality that Bobby Orr's career was approaching its end. And then came the departure from Boston. Bobby's contract with the Bruins expired after the 1975-76 season, and the negotiations for a new deal became one of the most controversial episodes in the history of professional sports. Bobby had entrusted his business affairs to Alan Eagleson, who had been his agent and advisor since he was 18 years old. Eagleson was by this time one of the most powerful men in hockey. He was the executive director of the NHL Players Association. He was involved in the organization of international hockey events. He was a lawyer, a power broker, a deal maker, and he was, as the world would eventually learn, a fraud. According to accounts that emerged years later, The Boston Bruins had offered Bobby Orr a contract that would have included a partial ownership stake in the team. It was an extraordinary offer, one that recognized Bobby's unique value to the franchise, and would have ensured that he remained a Bruin for the rest of his life. But Eagleson, who had his own financial incentives for steering Bobby elsewhere, did not fully communicate the Bruins' offer to his client. Instead, he guided Bobby towards signing with the Chicago Blackhawks as a free agent. The 1970-71 season was, in many respects, even more dominant than the one that preceded it. Bobby scored 37 goals and added 102 assists for 139 points, shattering his own record for points by a defenseman. 102 assists. No defenseman has ever approached that number before or since. To put it in perspective, there have been seasons in NHL history where entire forward lines did not produce 102 assists combined. Bobby was doing it alone, from the back end, while also playing 30 minutes or more per game and fulfilling his defensive responsibilities. The scope of the achievement is almost incomprehensible. The Bruins themselves were a juggernaut that season. Esposito scored 76 goals, a record at the time. 4 Bruins players scored more than 40 goals. The team set records for goals scored in a season that would stand for years. They were the best team in hockey by a wide margin, and they entered the 1971 playoffs as overwhelming favourites to repeat as Stanley Cup champions. The hockey world expected a coronation. What they got was one of the most shocking upsets in playoff history. The Montreal Canadiens, who had finished far behind the Bruins in the regular season, had a young, largely untested goaltender named Ken Dryden. Dryden had played only 6 regular season games for the Canadiens, but he was tall, athletic, and possessed of an unusual composure for a player with so little experience. In the first round of the playoffs, the Bruins ran into Dryden, and Dryden was magnificent. He stopped shots that should have been goals. He anticipated plays that should have caught him out of position. He frustrated the most potent offensive team in hockey with a performance that was equal parts skill and audacity. The Canadiens won the series in 7 games, and the Bruins, for all their regular season dominance, were eliminated in the opening round. The loss was devastating. Bobby played through it with his typical stoicism, but the disappointment was evident. He had been the best player in the series, producing points in virtually every game, but even his brilliance was not enough to overcome the extraordinary goaltending of Dryden. The defeat haunted the Bruins and their fans throughout the following summer and into the next season. It was a reminder that in playoff hockey, talent does not always prevail, that the game has a capacity for cruelty and surprise that no amount of regular season dominance can eliminate. The response to the 1971 upset was exactly what you would expect from Bobby Orr and the Bruins. They came back the following season more determined and more focused than ever. Bobby scored 37 goals and added 80 assists for 117 points. He won his 5th consecutive Norris Trophy and his 3rd consecutive Hart Trophy. The Bruins returned to the Stanley Cup Final, where they faced the New York Rangers. This time, there was no upset. The Bruins won the series in 6 games, with Bobby contributing throughout with his typical combination of offensive brilliance and defensive dominance. It was Bobby's 2nd Stanley Cup, and it would be his last. The summer of 1972 brought the Summit Series, the historic 8-game confrontation between Team Canada and the Soviet Union. Bobby was named to the Canadian roster, and his inclusion was considered essential. He was, after all, the best player in the world, the one player whose talent and vision could match the sophisticated passing game of the Soviets. But Bobby's knee had other plans. The injuries that had been accumulating since his teenage years had reached a critical point, and Bobby was unable to play in the Summit Series. His absence was felt acutely. Canada won the series, famously, on Paul Henderson's goal in the final minute of Game 8, but the hockey world was left to wonder what the series might have looked like with Bobby Orr in the lineup. Many who were present have said that Bobby, at full health, would have dominated the series, that his combination of speed, skill, and hockey intelligence was precisely what was needed to counter the Soviet style. It is one of the many what-ifs that surround Bobby's career, Another tantalizing glimpse of what might have been if his body had been able to keep pace with his talent. The seasons that followed the second Stanley Cup were a mixture of continued brilliance and accelerating physical decline. The 1972-73 season saw Bobby limited to 63 games by his knee problems, but he still produced 101 points. The pattern was becoming clear. Bobby would have surgery in the off-season. He would rehabilitate the knee. He would return to the lineup. He would play brilliantly for a stretch of games, demonstrating that his skills were undiminished, that his mind was still the sharpest in hockey, and then the knee would flare up again. The swelling would return, the pain would intensify, and Bobby would miss more time, watching from the press box or the training room as his teammates played without him. The 1973-74 season was another demonstration of Bobby's extraordinary ability to perform at the highest level despite his physical limitations. He played 74 games and recorded 122 points, winning his 7th Norris Trophy and his 3rd Hart Trophy. The Bruins reached the Stanley Cup final for the 3rd time in 5 years, but lost to the Philadelphia Flyers, the Broad Street Bullies, in 6 games. The Flyers series was a brutal, physical affair that took a further toll on Bobby's already battered body. The final full season, 1974-75, produced perhaps the most bittersweet performance of Bobby's career. Despite the chronic pain, despite the years of surgical intervention, despite the fact that his knee was deteriorating with every game, Bobby scored 46 goals. 46 goals from a defenseman. It was the highest goal total of his career, a stunning achievement that demonstrated the extraordinary depth of his talent. He also won his 8th and final Norris Trophy, cementing a record that seems destined to stand forever. 8 consecutive Norris Trophies, each one a declaration that no other defenseman in the world could match what Bobby Orr brought to the ice. But the price of that season was steep. Bobby's knee was essentially destroyed. The cartilage was gone. The joint was bone on bone. Every stride, every stop, every pivot sent a shock of pain through his leg that would have been unbearable for most people. Bobby was not most people. He endured it because he loved the game, because the ice was where he felt most alive, and because he could not yet accept that his body was no longer capable of supporting his genius. The end, when it came, was shaped not by injury alone, but by betrayal. Alan Eagleson, who had represented Bobby since before his first professional contract, had been conducting negotiations with the Boston Bruins on Bobby's behalf. The Bruins, desperate to keep their greatest player, had reportedly offered Bobby a contract that included a partial ownership stake in the franchise, a deal that would have been unprecedented in professional hockey, and that would have provided Bobby with long-term financial security far beyond what any salary could offer. Eagleson, for reasons that have never been fully explained, but that are widely believed to have involved his own financial interests and his relationships with other NHL owners, failed to communicate the full terms of the Bruins' offer to Bobby. Instead, Eagleson steered Bobby toward free agency and toward a contract with the Chicago Blackhawks. Bobby, trusting the man who had guided his career since he was a teenager, signed with Chicago. He did not know about the ownership offer from Boston. He did not know that Eagleson had been working against his interests. He believed he was making the best decision available to him, based on the information he had been given. He was wrong, and the wrongness of that decision, the wrongness that was imposed upon him by the man he trusted, would become one of the most painful revelations of his life. Bobby signed with Chicago in June of 1976. The news devastated the city of Boston. Bobby Orr was not just a hockey player to the people of Boston. He was the franchise. He was the identity. He was the beating heart of the Bruins organization. His departure felt like a death in the family, a loss so profound that many fans never fully recovered from it. The bitterness lingered for years, directed at Bobby, at the Bruins management, at anyone who might be responsible. It was only later, when the truth about Eagleson's manipulation became public, that the real villain of the story was identified. Bobby had not wanted to leave Boston. He had been deceived by the one person he trusted most. The Chicago years were brief and painful. Bobby played in 20 games during the 1976-77 season. His knee could barely support him. The speed was gone. The explosive acceleration that had been his signature was gone. He could still see the ice, could still read the play, could still make smart passes and positional decisions. But he could no longer execute the way he once had. The gap between what his mind envisioned and what his body could produce had become a chasm. He had another surgery. He tried to come back the following year and managed only 6 games before the reality became unavoidable. On November 8, 1978, Bobby Orr announced his retirement from professional hockey. He was 30 years old. His career had spanned 12 seasons, but had produced only 657 regular season games. He had undergone more than a dozen knee surgeries over the course of his career. His left knee was essentially destroyed, the cartilage completely gone, the joint grinding bone on bone with every step. The young man who had once been the fastest and most graceful skater in the history of hockey could barely walk without pain. The financial and personal aftermath of the move to Chicago was devastating, in ways that went beyond the loss of his hockey home. Bobby had built a life in Boston. He had friends there. He had a community. He had become, in the most meaningful sense of the word, a Bostonian. The city had embraced him from the moment he arrived as an 18-year-old rookie, and the bond between Bobby and the people of Boston was deep and genuine. When he signed with Chicago, that bond was severed, and the pain of the separation was felt on both sides. In Chicago, Bobby tried to make the best of the situation. He was, as always, professional and dedicated. He worked hard in practice. He prepared meticulously for games. He was respectful to his new teammates and his new coaches. But the knee would not cooperate. The first season in Chicago produced 20 games, a handful of goals and assists, and a deepening realization that the end was approaching. The second season produced just 6 games in an entire season. For a man who had once played 80 games a year at the highest level, who had once led the league in scoring from the defensive position, 6 games was a cruel and heartbreaking number. The retirement announcement came on November 8, 1978. Bobby was composed but emotional. He thanked his teammates, his coaches, and the fans who had supported him throughout his career. He did not dwell on the injuries or the pain. He did not express bitterness about what might have been. He simply acknowledged that his body could no longer do what the game required, and that it was time to step away. The hockey world mourned. Tributes poured in from players, coaches, executives, and fans across North America and beyond. Bobby Orr was not just a great player retiring. He was a symbol, an icon, a figure who transcended the sport. His departure left a void that would never truly be filled. The career statistics, when laid out in their totality, tell a story of concentrated brilliance that has no parallel in the history of professional hockey. In 657 regular season games, Bobby accumulated 270 goals, 645 assists, and 915 points. His points per game average of 1.39 is among the highest in league history, and it was achieved from the defensive position. He played in 74 playoff games and recorded 26 goals and 66 assists for 92 points, a playoff points per game average of 1.24 that is equally impressive. The award tally is staggering. 8 Norris trophies, 3 Hart trophies, 2 Art Ross trophies, 2 Conn Smythe trophies, 1 Calder trophy, 3 Lester B. Pearson awards, voted on by the players themselves as the league's most outstanding player, 8 first-team All-Star selections, 2 Stanley Cup championships. He led the league in plus-minus rating for 6 consecutive seasons, and his career plus-minus of plus 597 is a record that seems destined to stand forever. Consider those numbers in the context of a career that lasted, in effective terms, fewer than 10 full seasons. Consider that many of those seasons were shortened by injury, that Bobby played through pain in virtually every game he ever played, that his body was deteriorating, even as his statistics were reaching their peak. The question is not whether Bobby Orr was the greatest defenseman who ever lived. That question was settled long ago, and the answer is beyond dispute. The question is what category to place him in. Was he the greatest player of all time? Some would say yes, that what he did from the defensive position, a position that inherently limits offensive production, is more impressive than what any forward has ever done. Others would argue that Wayne Gretzky's career numbers, accumulated over a much longer career, give him the edge. The debate is healthy and endless, and it speaks to the magnitude of Bobby Orr's achievement that a defenseman is even part of the conversation. The era itself left its mark on Bobby in ways that extended beyond the physical. The NHL of the 1960s and 70s was a different world from the league that exists today. Player salaries were modest by modern standards. The union was weak, and it was led by a man who was working against the players' interests. There were no multi-million-dollar endorsement deals, no comprehensive pension plans, no sophisticated financial advisory services for athletes. Bobby played in an era when the relationship between players and management was fundamentally unequal, and he was a victim of that inequality in ways that were not fully apparent until decades after his playing days were over. In those 657 games, Bobby Orr accumulated 270 goals and 645 assists for 915 points. He won the Norris Trophy 8 times, the Hart Trophy 3 times, the Art Ross Trophy twice, the Conn Smythe Trophy twice, and the Calder Trophy once. He was named to the first All-Star team 8 times. His career plus-minus rating of plus 597 remains the highest in NHL history. He led the league in plus-minus for 6 consecutive seasons. The numbers are striking because they represent what Bobby Orr accomplished in what was, by any measure, a truncated career. Wayne Gretzky played in nearly 1,500 regular season games. Gordie Howe played in more than 1,600. Marc Messier played in more than 1,700. Bobby Orr played in fewer than half of what any of those legends played. And yet, in those limited games, he produced statistics and won awards that place him in the conversation for the greatest player of all time. The question of what his career numbers would have looked like if his knees had held up, if he had been able to play until he was 35 or 38 or 40, is one of the most tantalizing hypotheticals in the history of sport. Imagine 5 more full seasons of 120-point performances. Imagine Bobby Orr accumulating 1,300, 1,400, 1,500 career points. From a defenseman, the mind struggles to comprehend it. The records that Wayne Gretzky holds, the records that seem untouchable, might well have belonged to a man who played the blue line. That is the scale of what was lost. That is the magnitude of what the game was denied. And through it all, through every surgery, every comeback attempt, every game played in agony, every morning when he woke up and could barely stand, Bobby Orr never complained. Not publicly, not to his teammates, not to the press. He played because he loved the game. He played because the ice was the one place in the world where he felt most alive, most himself, most free. And when the ice was finally taken from him, when his knees could no longer support the weight of his genius, he walked away with a dignity that matched the grace with which he had played. But here's the thing about Bobby Orr's challenges. They did not end when he retired. They continued, in different forms, for years afterward. The physical pain persisted. Both knees eventually required full replacement surgery. The rehabilitation was long and difficult. The man who had once moved with more speed and agility than any hockey player alive struggled with basic mobility, walking, climbing stairs, getting in and out of a car. The simplest physical activities became sources of discomfort, and Bobby bore it all with the same quiet stoicism that had characterized his playing career. He did not seek pity. He did not lament what had been taken from him. He simply adapted and moved forward. The deeper truth about Bobby Orr is not found in the statistics or the trophies or even the famous photograph of him flying through the air. It is found in what happened after the cheering stopped. It is found in the quiet aftermath of a career that burned so brightly and was extinguished so soon. It is found in the silence of life lived with chronic pain, with the knowledge that the thing you were best at in this world, the thing that defined you more completely than your name or your face or any other single quality, was taken from you before you reached the fullest expression of your potential. Bobby Orr retired at 30 years old. Let that sink in. 30. Most professional hockey players at that age are in the middle of their careers, not the end. Gordie Howe was still playing at the age of 52. Chris Chelios played until he was 48. Jaromir Jagr was still competing professionally in his late 40s. These are extreme examples, But even by more conventional standards, 30 is young. It is the age at which many players are just beginning to accumulate the experience and the savvy that allow them to compete at the highest level even after their physical tools begin to decline. Bobby Orr never had that opportunity. His physical tools did not gradually decline over the course of a long career. They were taken from him abruptly, violently, surgically, over the course of a decade that should have been the richest and most productive of his life. The greatest defenseman who ever played hockey, a man who redefined an entire position in a sport that had existed for more than a century, was finished before his 30th birthday, not because his desire had waned, not because his understanding of the game had diminished, not because he had lost the competitive fire that drives athletes to push through exhaustion and adversity, because his body physically could not do what his mind and his heart still yearned to do. The knees that had been operated on again and again and again, more than a dozen times over the course of his career, had nothing left to give. The cartilage was gone. The bones were grinding against each other with every step. The pain was constant and inescapable. Bobby Orr, the fastest skater who had ever lived, could barely walk without discomfort. In the years following his retirement, Bobby underwent additional surgeries. He had both knees replaced, a procedure that involves removing the damaged natural joint and installing artificial components made of metal and plastic. Knee replacement surgery is major surgery, requiring months of rehabilitation, and it imposes its own limitations on physical activity. The artificial joints are durable, but they are not natural joints. They do not replicate the full range of motion and the fluid movement that a healthy natural knee provides. Bobby adapted. He had no choice. And the truth gets heavier when you consider the role that Alan Eagleson played in the second great wound of Bobby's life. The physical damage to his knees was one kind of betrayal, the betrayal of his body by the sport he loved. The financial and personal damage inflicted by his trusted agent was another kind entirely, a betrayal of his trust by the person he had relied upon to protect his interests. For more than 2 decades, Bobby Orr believed that Alan Eagleson had acted in good faith on his behalf. He had no reason to doubt the man who had been his agent since he was 18, who had negotiated his contracts, who had managed his finances, who had advised him on every major business decision of his career. Eagleson was not just Bobby's agent. He was the executive director of the NHL Players Association, one of the most powerful and visible figures in the sport. He was respected, feared, and trusted by players, owners, and journalists alike. Bobby trusted him because everyone trusted him. There was no reason not to. The truth about Eagleson began to emerge in the late 1980s and early 1990s, largely through the investigative journalism of Russ Conway, a reporter for the Eagle Tribune newspaper in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Conway spent years investigating Eagleson's business dealings, interviewing former clients, examining financial records, and piecing together a portrait of systematic fraud and self-dealing that spanned decades. The picture that emerged was damning. Eagleson had stolen money from the players he was supposed to represent. He had diverted funds from international hockey tournaments into his own accounts. He had made deals with team owners that benefited himself at the expense of his clients. He had used his position as head of the Players Association to enrich himself while the players he represented received far less than they deserved. In Bobby Orr's case, the betrayal was specific and deeply personal. Eagleson had failed to properly communicate the Boston Bruins' contract offer, which reportedly included a partial ownership stake in the team, an offer that would have kept Bobby in Boston for the rest of his career and provided him with long-term financial security. Instead, Eagleson guided Bobby toward a free agent contract with the Chicago Blackhawks, a move that served Eagleson's interests but not Bobby's. The consequences were enormous. Bobby lost his home in Boston. He lost the chance to end his career with the franchise that loved him. He lost a financial opportunity that could have set him up for life. Let that sink in. The greatest player in the history of the Boston Bruins, the man who had transformed the franchise from the worst team in the league to Stanley Cup champions, who had filled Boston Garden night after night, who had given the city some of the most thrilling moments in its sports history. was manipulated out of Boston by the one person he trusted to look after him. The fans of Boston lost their hero, Bobby lost his home, and Alan Eagleson collected his fees. In 1998, Eagleson pleaded guilty to 3 counts of fraud in a Boston courtroom. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison, of which he served 6. He was disbarred by the Law Society of Upper Canada. He resigned from the Hockey Hall of Fame under pressure, and the Hall subsequently voted to remove him. The full scope of his crimes against the players he represented, including Bobby Orr, became a matter of public record. The physical toll of Bobby's career extended far beyond the surgeries and the rehabilitation. It permeated every aspect of his daily life in ways that most people never saw and that Bobby rarely discussed. The mornings were the worst. After a night of sleep, during which the joints would stiffen and the inflammation would settle in, Bobby would wake to a body that felt decades older than its actual age. The simple act of getting out of bed required a mental negotiation between will and pain. Walking to the bathroom involved a careful, measured gait that bore no resemblance to the effortless glide that had once made him the most graceful athlete in hockey. By midday, the joints would loosen and the pain would recede to a manageable level, but it never disappeared entirely. It was always there, a constant companion, a reminder of the price that had been paid for those years of brilliance on the ice. Both knees eventually required total replacement surgery, a procedure that involves removing the damaged joint surfaces and replacing them with artificial components made of metal and plastic. The surgeries were major undertakings, each one followed by months of rehabilitation. Bobby approached each surgery and each rehabilitation with the same discipline and determination that had characterized his playing career. He did the exercises. He followed the protocols. He worked through the discomfort without complaint. The artificial knees gave him improved function and reduced pain, but they were not a cure. They were a compromise, a technological approximation of what nature had originally provided and what hockey had taken away. The emotional dimensions of Bobby's post-career life were as complex as the physical ones. There was grief, certainly, for the career that had been cut short, for the seasons that were never played, for the records that were never set. Bobby has spoken about this grief, only rarely and always with restraint, acknowledging the loss without dwelling on it, expressing gratitude for what he was able to accomplish rather than bitterness about what was denied him. This perspective did not come easily or naturally. It was earned through years of reflection and through the kind of internal work that athletes, particularly male athletes of Bobby's generation, were not encouraged to do. The culture of hockey demanded toughness, demanded stoicism, demanded that you bury your emotions and move forward. Bobby eventually found a way to move forward while also acknowledging what had been lost, and that balance, that emotional maturity, is one of the most impressive achievements of his post-career life. The Eagleson scandal, when it finally broke into public consciousness, forced Bobby to confront feelings that he had kept carefully contained for years. The anger was there. It had to be. The man who was supposed to protect Bobby's interests had systematically betrayed them. The financial consequences were significant, but they were not the worst of it. The worst of it was the personal betrayal, the violation of trust that cut to the core of Bobby's sense of how the world was supposed to work. Bobby had grown up in a family and a community where your word was your bond, where trust was the foundation of every relationship, where people looked out for each other, because that was simply what decent people did. Eagleson had exploited that trust, had used Bobby's decency and his loyalty as weapons against him, and the wound that caused was deeper and more lasting than any knee injury. Yet Bobby did not allow the betrayal to define him. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about his response to the Eagleson affair. He could have spent the rest of his life as a victim, and no one would have blamed him. He could have become bitter and cynical, withdrawn and suspicious. Instead, he chose to channel the experience into something constructive. His work as a player agent was, in many ways, a direct response to what Eagleson had done to him. Bobby was determined to be the agent that he wished he had had, the advocate who put his client's interests first, who communicated honestly and transparently, who never confused his own financial interests with those of the players he represented. The broader legacy of the Eagleson scandal extended far beyond Bobby Orr's personal experience. It forced the hockey world to confront the structural inequities that had allowed one man to wield so much unchecked power over the careers and finances of professional athletes. It led to reforms in the NHL Players Association, which had been Eagleson's personal fiefdom for decades. It prompted the development of more robust financial oversight mechanisms for player agents and advisors. It contributed to a growing awareness among professional athletes, not just in hockey but in all sports, of the importance of independent financial advice and the dangers of placing too much trust in a single individual. Bobby's response to the scandal also became a model for how public figures could handle personal crisis with dignity and grace. In an era of increasingly public and increasingly acrimonious disputes between athletes and their former advisors, Bobby's quiet, measured approach stood out. He did not seek vengeance. He did not seek publicity. He sought only to move forward, to build a meaningful life beyond the ice, and to use his experience, both the glorious and the painful, to help others. It was a response that earned him as much respect and admiration as anything he had ever done on the ice. In the years that followed, Bobby became something rare in the world of professional sports. A former athlete who was universally admired, not just for what he had done during his playing days, but for how he had conducted himself afterward. The respect he commanded was not based on nostalgia or sentimentality. It was based on a genuine recognition that Bobby Orr was a man of substance and character, a man who had been tested in ways that most people never are, and who had emerged from those tests with his integrity intact. The young man who had left Parry Sound at 14 to pursue his dream of playing professional hockey had become, decades later, a figure of quiet authority and moral clarity, admired by teammates, opponents, coaches, executives, journalists, and fans across the hockey world and beyond. Bobby handled the Eagleson situation the way he handled everything in his life, with composure, with quiet resolve, with an unwillingness to dwell in bitterness or to seek public sympathy for what had been done to him. He did not go on a media tour. He did not write a sensational book. He did not grant interviews designed to vilify Eagleson, even though he would have been entirely justified in doing so. He simply moved forward. He rebuilt his professional life. He became a player agent himself, working with young hockey players and ensuring that they received the kind of honest, transparent, ethical representation that he had been denied. He became a mentor, a quiet presence in the hockey world, offering guidance and support to players who sought his advice. The personal qualities that made Bobby Orr great on the ice were the same qualities that defined him off it. He was humble in a way that went beyond public relations or image management. He was genuinely humble, genuinely uncomfortable with attention and praise, genuinely more interested in the people around him than in himself. He was generous with his time, his money, and his presence. He never forgot Parry Sound. He never lost touch with the people and the community that had shaped him. He visited his hometown regularly. He supported local charities and causes. He remained, at his core, the small-town boy who happened to have been blessed with extraordinary talent. There is a story that captures this quality. Years after his retirement, at a charity event attended by wealthy donors and prominent figures, Bobby arrived early and spent the first hour in the kitchen, thanking every cook, every server, every busboy for their work. He shook their hands. He asked their names. He treated them as the most important people in the room. When someone asked him why he was spending his time in the kitchen rather than with the guests of honor, Bobby said simply that the people in the kitchen were the ones doing the real work, and they deserve to be thanked. The legacy of Bobby Orr as a person, distinct from his legacy as a player, is equally remarkable. In an era when many former professional athletes struggled with the transition to life after sports, Bobby navigated that transition with the same quiet competence that had characterized his playing career. He did not become a recluse, withdrawing from public life and nursing his grievances in private. Nor did he become a celebrity, trading on his fame for attention and money. He found a middle path, remaining involved in hockey in a meaningful way, while also building a life that had purpose and value beyond the rink. His work as a player agent was central to this new chapter. Bobby founded a sports management company and took on a small number of clients, young hockey players who were navigating the face as a teenager leaving Parry Sound for the first time. He was deeply involved in his clients' careers, not just in the business and contractual aspects, but in the personal dimensions as well. He counseled them on the pressures of professional sports. He helped them manage the transition from junior hockey to the NHL. He protected them from the kinds of predatory practices that had victimized him during his own career. The experience with Eaglesons had taught him a painful lesson, and he was determined to ensure that the players under his care would never have to learn that lesson for themselves. Bobby also maintained close ties to the community of hockey. He attended charity events, he participated in alumni games, he visited hospitals and schools. He was a regular presence at Bruins games, where his appearance in the stands was always greeted with a standing ovation that seemed to grow louder with each passing year. The love that the city of Boston felt for Bobby Orr did not diminish with time. If anything, it deepened as the full story of his career became more widely known and more fully understood. The fans who had once cheered his goals now cheered his presence, his courage, his endurance, his refusal to be diminished by the injuries and the betrayals that had shaped his life. The relationship between Bobby and the city of Boston is one of the most genuine and enduring bonds between an athlete and a community in the history of professional sports. It is a relationship built not on marketing or branding, but on shared experience and authentic emotion. The people of Boston watched Bobby arrive as a teenager and transform their franchise. They watched him win 2 Stanley Cups. They watched him suffer through injuries that broke their hearts. They lost him to Chicago and grieved. They welcomed him back years later as a beloved elder statesman. And through all of it, the bond never weakened. Bobby Orr is Boston in the same way that Ted Williams was Boston, that Bill Russell was Boston. He is woven into the identity of the city, inseparable from its history and its sense of self. That is who Bobby Orr was. That is who he remains. A man of extraordinary talent and extraordinary humility. A man who played the most beautiful hockey anyone has ever seen and paid a price that no one should ever have to pay. A man who was betrayed by his own body and by the person he trusted most, and who responded to both betrayals with a grace and a decency that never wavered, not even for a moment. What Bobby Orr left behind is woven into the very fabric of the sport of hockey. It is there every time a defenseman picks up the puck behind his own net and begins to skate forward with purpose and intention. It is there every time a coach designs a power play that features a mobile, offensively gifted defenseman at the point. It is there every time a young player watches a highlight reel from the late 1960s and early 1970s and dreams of carrying the puck from one end of the ice to the other, leaving defenders in his wake, finishing with a goal that brings an arena to its feet. That dream was made possible by Bobby Orr. It did not exist before him. The lineage of offensive defensemen that stretches from Bobby's era to the present day is direct and unbroken. Paul Coffey, who starred for the Edmonton Oilers in the 1980s, was one of the highest-scoring defensemen in NHL history. Coffey has spoken openly and frequently about the influence that Bobby Orr had on his development as a player. He watched Bobby on television as a young boy and decided that he wanted to play the game the same way. He wanted to skate. He wanted to carry the puck. He wanted to be the player who made things happen, not the player who stood back and watched. Coffey's extraordinary career, which included 3 Stanley Cup championships, 4 Norris Trophy nominations, and more than 1,000 career points from the blue line, was a direct extension of the path that Bobby Orr had blazed. Ray Bourque inherited the mantle of the elite defenseman in Boston and carried it with distinction for more than 2 decades. Bourque grew up in Montreal watching Bobby Orr play, and he has said that Bobby was the reason he fell in love with the defensive position. When Bourque arrived in Boston as a rookie in 1979, the year of Bobby's retirement, he stepped into a role that had been defined by Bobby's greatness. Bourque wore number 77 for the Bruins, not number 4, because number 4 had been retired and hung from the rafters of Boston Garden. But he played with a commitment to both ends of the ice that echoed Bobby's approach. accumulating more than 1,500 career points over 22 seasons, winning 5 Norris trophies, and earning respect as one of the most complete defensemen the game has ever produced. Nicklas Lidstrom of the Detroit Red Wings represented a different branch of the tree that Bobby planted. Lidstrom was a Swedish defenseman, calm and cerebral, who relied more on positioning and intelligence than on explosive speed. He won the Norris Trophy 7 times and 4 Stanley Cup championships. His style was different from Bobby's, but the philosophical foundation was the same. The defenseman as a complete player. The defenseman as someone who contributes to every phase of the game. The defenseman as the most important player on the ice, not because he scores the most goals, but because he controls the flow and the outcome of every shift. In the modern era, players like Erik Karlsson and Cale Makar continue to push the boundaries of what a defenseman can accomplish offensively. Makar, who plays for the Colorado Avalanche, won the Norris Trophy and the Conn Smythe Trophy in his early 20s. He is often compared to Bobby Orr, and that comparison, which is the highest compliment that can be paid to any defenseman, is never offered casually. When people say that a young player reminds them of Bobby Orr, they are saying that this player has the potential to change the way the game is played. That is the standard Bobby set. That is the measurement against which all great defensemen are judged. But the legacy extends beyond individual players. Bobby Orr changed the culture of the position. He changed the way defensemen are scouted and developed. He changed the expectations that coaches have for their blue line players. Before Bobby, a defenseman who could skate and handle the puck was a pleasant surprise. After Bobby, those skills became requirements. The modern NHL defenseman is expected to be mobile, to be able to handle the puck under pressure, to be able to make a clean breakout pass, to be able to join the rush and contribute offensively. These expectations did not exist before Bobby Orr. He created them by demonstrating what was possible. The Bruins retired his number 4 on January 9, 1979. Shortly after his retirement, he was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame later that same year, at the age of 31, with the mandatory 3-year waiting period waived. It was an acknowledgement of what everyone already knew. Bobby Orr belonged in the Hall from the moment he first stepped on NHL ice. The waiting period was a formality that would have been insulting in its application to a player of his stature. The era he represented, the late 1960s and early 1970s, was a time of transformation for hockey. The sport was expanding geographically, reaching new audiences across the United States. It was growing commercially, with larger television contracts and greater media attention. And Bobby Orr was the face of that growth, the player who made hockey exciting for people who had never watched a game in their lives. He proved that hockey could produce transcendent stars, athletes whose fame and appeal extended far beyond the boundaries of the rink and the sport. And yet there is a melancholy that accompanies the memory of Bobby Orr, because when we think of him, we think not only of what he accomplished, but of what he might have accomplished. We think of the seasons that were stolen by injury, the goals that were never scored, the assists that were never recorded, the plays that were never made. We think of a career that burned so brilliantly and was extinguished so cruelly, and we wonder what might have been if the knees had held up, if the medical science of the era had been more advanced, if the game had been less willing to consume the bodies of the men who played it. We think of a young man flying through the air in Boston Garden, arms raised, body horizontal, the purest expression of athletic joy and freedom that the sport has ever produced. And we know that moment was both a beginning and an ending. The beginning of an eternal legend, and the beginning of the end of a career that should have lasted so much longer than it did. The game has evolved in the decades since Bobby played. Equipment is lighter and more protective. Training methods are more sophisticated. Medical care has advanced enormously. If Bobby Orr had been born 30 years later, with access to arthroscopic surgery and modern rehabilitation protocols, and the accumulated knowledge of sports medicine, the story might have been entirely different. He might have played until he was 38 or 40. He might have accumulated statistics that would challenge every record in the book. But he was born when he was born, and he played when he played, And the game gave him what it gave him and took what it took. That is the nature of sport and the nature of time. There is a statue outside TD Garden in Boston. It was unveiled in 2010, 40 years after the goal it depicts. The statue shows Bobby Orr in full flight, arms raised, body horizontal, frozen forever in the pose from May 10, 1970. Bobby was there for the unveiling. He was 62 years old by then. His hair had turned grey. His knees, long since replaced with artificial joints, ached with the dull persistence that had become the constant companion of his later years. He stood before the statue and looked at the bronze figure suspended in mid-air, this frozen echo of his younger self, and the emotion on his face was unmistakable. It was not vanity. It was not nostalgia in the simple sense. It was something quieter and deeper. A recognition that the boy from Parry Sound had become something larger than himself, that the moment captured in bronze belonged not just to him, but to every person who had ever loved hockey, to the city that had adopted him, to the sport that had been changed by him. Bobby Orr changed the way hockey was played. That sentence is simple to write and almost impossible to fully comprehend. He took a position that had been defined by its limitations and he removed those limitations entirely. He showed that the defenseman could be the fastest player on the ice, the most creative player on the ice, the most dangerous player on the ice, the most important player on the ice. He demonstrated that the boundaries between offense and defense, which had been treated as permanent and inviolable for more than half a century, were nothing more than habits of thought. He replaced those habits with a new vision, a vision in which a single player could influence every aspect of the game, from preventing goals to scoring them, from breaking up attacks to creating them, from clearing the puck to carrying it coast to coast, and putting it in the net himself. He also showed, without meaning to, the price that the game extracts from those who give themselves to it completely. The surgeries, the pain, the stolen years, the knowledge that the body has limits that the spirit does not. Bobby Orr played hockey with a combination of skill and commitment and fearlessness that has never been replicated. He threw his body into every play. He absorbed hits that would have broken lesser men. He played through injuries that would have ended most careers. And the game rewarded him with moments of transcendent beauty and punished him with decades of physical suffering. There is a profound tension in the story of Bobby Orr, a tension between beauty and pain, between triumph and loss, between what was given and what was taken away. He experienced the highest highs that hockey can offer, the Stanley Cup raised above his head, the adoration of an entire city, the knowledge that he was the best at what he did. And he experienced the lowest lows, the knee that would not stop swelling, the agent who would not stop lying, the career that would not stop ending. The two sides of the story cannot be separated. They are part of the same whole. The beauty is inseparable from the pain, and the pain is inseparable from the beauty. In the end, the story of Bobby Orr is the story of hockey itself. It is a story about a game played on ice, in the cold, by men who are willing to sacrifice their bodies for the chance to experience something extraordinary. It is a story about beauty and brutality existing side by side, about moments so perfect they seem to stop time and consequences so severe they remind us that time never actually stops. The photograph of Bobby flying through the air is beautiful because it freezes a moment of pure, unbridled joy. But it is also heartbreaking because we know what comes after the photograph was taken. We know about the surgeries, we know about the pain, we know about the abbreviated career, and the betrayal and the long years of living with what the game left behind. Bobby Orr was not merely a hockey player, he was an idea made flesh. The idea that one person with sufficient talent and sufficient courage can change the world. Not the whole world, not in the way that statesmen and scientists change the world, but the world of a sport, the world of a city, the world of every person who watched him play and felt something stir inside them, something that told them they were witnessing greatness, something that told them this was rare, something that told them to pay attention, because what was happening on the ice at that moment would never happen again. He came from a small town. He had bad knees. He trusted the wrong person. He retired too young. He lived with pain for the rest of his life. And none of it matters when you see the photograph. None of it matters when you watch the old footage of Bobby Orr picking up the puck behind his own net and beginning to skate, his head up, his body leaning forward, the ice opening before him like a promise. Because in that moment, in the moment of flight, everything was perfect. The game was perfect. The player was perfect. The beauty was complete and undeniable. The ice remembers Bobby Orr. The city of Boston remembers. The sport of hockey remembers. The old garden, long since demolished, remembers in the way that places remember the extraordinary things that happened within their walls. And the statue outside TD Garden remembers, standing in the cold Boston air, suspended forever in the moment when a young man from Parry Sound left the ice and, for just a fraction of a second, flew. Number 4. Bobby Orr, the defenseman who flew, the boy who changed the game, the man who paid the price, the sound of skates on ice, the echo of a crowd in a cold arena, the sight of a young man in a white jersey, number 4 on his back, gliding toward the blue line with the puck on his stick, and the entire opposing team falling back, uncertain, afraid of what he might do next. These are the images that endure. These are the memories that the game has given us through Bobby Orr. They are memories of a time when hockey was played with a rawness and an authenticity that reflected the character of the men who played it. They are memories of a sport that was, for all its beauty, profoundly demanding. A sport that gave glory with one hand and extracted suffering with the other. Bobby Orr knew both the glory and the suffering. He knew the exhilaration of scoring the overtime goal that won the Stanley Cup. He knew the desolation of watching his knee swell to twice its normal size after a game, of sitting in a training room with a needle in his joint, of waking up in the morning and wondering whether today would be the day the knee finally refused to cooperate. He knew the warmth of being loved by an entire city and the cold realization that the man he trusted had been working against him for years. He knew all of it, every extreme, every contradiction, and he bore it all with a steadiness that is, in its own way, as remarkable as anything he ever did on the ice. And the ice, as it always does, keeps the memory.